Hello everyone. If you're a Japanese language learner, you've probably noticed the obsession with pitch accent these last few years or so. I must admit, even I got a bit swept up in it a few years ago, and for a short time even ended up believing in its importance. But after reaching an advanced level, I've come to realize it's not actually nearly as important as the pitch pushers claim, and the whole obsession with pitch just honestly seems bizarre to me now. If you want to study pitch accent, I won't tell you to quit, but I simply want to debunk the widely believed pernicious myth that you need to study pitch accent to sound good, and I really don't think it's necessary at all. Many of the talking points for pitch accent that I'll be arguing against in this video are almost entirely from the YouTuber Matt vs Japan. I don't have anything against him personally, it's just that he is probably the most prominent pitch polemicist on the internet, and he seems to have originated many of the most common pro-pitch arguments. So let's get into it. Here are the top reasons why you should ditch pitch as soon as you can. Immersion will mostly take care of it. Yes, I've seen the videos that nitpick all the so-called pitch accent mistakes that highly advanced learners make while speaking. It might be easy to see that and conclude that you can't acquire pitch accent and it's necessary to study it, but there's a few things you should consider first. Firstly, because emphasis is put on the mistakes, it's easy to overlook the fact that most of it is actually correct and just how minor and subtle many of those so-called mistakes are. Secondly, many of those so-called mistakes don't necessarily sound non-native. Many times it just sounds like a different pronunciation of that word or phrase that would be preferred in a different region somewhere outside of Tokyo. Sure, there are some people who claim that it's bad to have a mixed pronunciation and accent and should focus on the pronunciation from a specific region for the sake of consistency. Anyone who claims this is a naughty boy who deserves a good spanking, because this is nothing but baseless fanaticism. The only people in any language who have a pure specific regional accent are those who spent their lives in a specific region. Anyone who moved around when they were growing up or had significant exposure to other regional accents will end up with a mixed accent in their native language to varying degrees. And even then there will be accent variation based on so many factors: age, sex, personality. Hell, even knowing a foreign language can have subtle impacts on the pronunciation of your first language. To suggest that you must aim to have a consistent accent from a region even though many native speakers don't is foolish at best, and exceedingly naughty at worst. I've spoken to native speakers who constantly make so-called pitch accent mistakes when they try to speak standard Japanese simply because they didn't grow up around Tokyo. So why should you care so much? In this one popular video which points out all the supposed pitch mistakes of advanced learners, you'll see that most of the comments from native speakers mention that many of the mistakes in the video they probably wouldn't have even noticed. I even found one comment from a southern Japanese person who said that if he/she were to speak standard Japanese, it would probably sound like many of the speakers in the video, and that if the speakers in the video had East Asian faces, he/she would probably assume they're Japanese. I didn't manage to find any comments from natives on this video extolling the importance of pitch accent. It's telling that this video was supposedly checked by someone born and raised in Tokyo. If it were a native speaker from somewhere more regional, there's a chance they wouldn't have even picked up on many of these so-called mistakes. Here's another thing. At the lower levels, knowing pitch accent won't give you any results, and yet the better you get, the less need you'll have for it. Let's call it the pitch paradox. At the lower levels, you're going to sound bad. There's no way around it, and you're probably going to be frequently misunderstood, regardless of whether you study pitch or not. The better you get, however, the more natural you'll sound and the less need you'll have to learn pitch, since you'll already be perfectly understood regardless of whether you make some so-called pitch mistakes. To put it simply, at lower levels, pitch is useless because you already sound bad, but at higher levels, it's useless because you already sound good. Pitch peddlers often bring up examples of foreigners who constantly mess up pitch and sound very unnatural as reasons why you should study pitch. But the people who actually sound really bad don't sound bad because they're just messing up pitch. They sound bad because they're messing up everything: the sounds, intonation, sentence structure, etc. Pitch accent is going to make little difference. Getting a lot of input will make all the difference. Ironically, one of the most convincing cases I've heard to support the idea that pitch accent can be acquired naturally comes from another infamous pitch proselytizer. The Japanese learner Ken Cannon, in his interview with Matt vs Japan, talked about his experience learning Japanese almost entirely through listening. Through this, he apparently attained a very accurate ability to produce the correct pitch in standard Japanese, whilst many of the words he learnt later through text or other means of conscious study, he tended to produce more erroneously. If you trust his story, and why wouldn't you, he's only the most trusted figure on the internet, then this means that learning with a focus on comprehensible input and immersion from the start, rather than conscious study, is the best way to naturally acquire pitch accent. And yet almost in the same breath, he claims you need to study pitch accent to sound good, and the video was released in the first place as a means of promoting his extravagantly priced private pitch course, demonstrating yet another example of the very naughty behaviour from some of the pitch promoters on the internet. Whether pitch pursuers actually sound more native than non-pitch accent studiers is a point of contention which I'll explore further in the video, but for now, let's assume that studying pitch accent will improve your accent. But even so, when you consider this next possible drawback, is it really worth it? Pitch accent could hurt your spoken fluency. I touched on this briefly in a previous video, but to put it succinctly, the more you learn and obsess over pitch, the more you'll be conscious of it while speaking. This consciousness translates into extra mental effort while speaking, which will potentially slow you down and make it harder to communicate. I speak from experience. Even though I never studied pitch accent rules and patterns, simply by having forced myself to pay attention to it for so long while listening makes me overly aware of the intonation when I try to speak. Speaking a foreign language already requires so much mental energy. Why would you want to burden yourself with even more cognitive load? Is it really worth potentially harming your spoken fluency just to make your accent sound a bit closer to a native? That's for you to decide. In a way, the pitch accent craze is just another symptom of the obsession with having to sound native. But what about feeling native? To me, how native you feel when you speak is a far greater indicator of how close you are to a native speaker than whether you have a slight accent. Would you say someone who's constantly monitoring their speech for pitch accent mistakes is native-like in any sense of the word? Natives are able to speak spontaneously without having a conscious awareness of the rules and details. The more you obsess over pitch, the further away you become from the way an actual native speaks, even if you manage to artificially make your accent sound closer to a native. Regardless of how native your accent is, if you can't string a short sentence together without deliberating about things like pitch or grammar, you've already lost to a 2-year-old native. This obsession with sounding native instead of feeling native and thereby being able to communicate more freely and effectively all seems rather superficial to me. Like someone who's so obsessed with appearing healthy and looking good that they'll try everything from beauty products to diet pills to plastic surgery, all while eating nothing but junk food, sleeping 3 hours a night and never exercising. If you strive so hard to appear native, even if it means potentially sabotaging your ability to produce spontaneous language in a way similar to a native, what is it but an exercise in vanity? The argument could even be made that having a 100% native accent isn't a prerequisite for being native in a language. As an example to illustrate this point, there were 2 bilingual acquaintances I had in university. One had come to Australia from Taiwan as a small boy and the other from Iran. Both had been in an English-speaking environment since the age of around 5 or 6, had completed all their education in English, and both were unquestionably native, probably possessing a greater ability in English compared to the language of their respective home countries. And yet both had a slight foreign accent when they spoke. There are many potential reasons for this, but whatever the reason, I see examples of this as a strong case for the argument that having native ability in a language does not necessarily equate to having a native accent. The point is they could both understand and use the language in the same way a native would, even with a slight foreign accent. This is a point I really want to stress because I feel it's an important point that I haven't heard anyone else make. That is the difference between feeling native and sounding native. Every time you focus on pitch accent while speaking, the further you distance yourself from achieving the ability to speak like an actual native would. But what about the person listening to you? Won't natives find it annoying to listen to you if you have incorrect pitch? That brings me to my next point. Native speakers really don't give a fuck. When you speak to a non-native English speaker who has incredibly natural sounding English but occasionally says a word with a different stress or intonation to the dialect you're used to hearing, is it jarring for you? Do you negatively judge their intelligence? Does it annoy you and make you want to avoid them? Does it make you want to curse their name and bring misery upon them and their posterity 10 generations henceforth? If you're not a compulsive obsessive phonetics nerd, the chances are you probably weren't even aware of these mistakes. Sure, it might give off a whiff of slight exoticism, but it most likely didn't even register consciously because you were too busy actually listening to what the other person was saying and communicating like a regular human being instead of obsessing over and nitpicking every small mistake you could find. After living in Japan and working for half a year in a totally Japanese environment, and witnessing many second language Japanese speakers communicating with natives, I've come to realize just how little people actually give a fuck about your accent, and in particular, pitch accent. Sure, if you have a thick accent and your pronunciation is awkward and hard to understand in places, people will notice, and it probably won't be as easy to speak with you. But anyone who's gotten enough input and has used the right methods to acquire the language will not have this problem, as they will sound totally understandable and sufficiently natural. Even if you do manage to sound perfect, some people might be impressed for the first 10 seconds, and you might get a few words of praise that titillate your ego and make you feel special, but after that, no one will care. If you're lurking around in the depths of the Japanese learning community, it's easy to forget this simple fact because the Japanese learning community seems to have an unhealthy fetish with sounding 100% native. But when you actually become able to communicate and use the language, you wake up and realize the real world doesn't at all reflect the fetishistic fixations and fantasies of phonetics fanatics and pitch persuaders. There are so many facets of communication whose importance overshadow pitch to an astronomical degree. And yet why do so many people fixate on such minor bits of rubbish like pitch? What you say, the words you use, the tone of your voice, these are all factors that are unbelievably more important than saying a hadaka naka word with an atama baka pitch. Even non-linguistic factors, your facial expression, your movements, your appearance, have an arguably larger impact than verbal ones. Your speech is only a part of your overall impression. Your accent is only a part of your speech, and your pitch accent is only an even smaller part of your accent. It's only one small ingredient of one small dish among many at a grand buffet. I have seen and interacted with many Japanese-speaking foreigners here. I've even met people with near-perfect accents, and I can tell you that the best speaker of Japanese I met was a Chinese guy who, despite having a Chinese accent, wasn't afraid to speak and wasn't obsessed with sounding perfect. Sure, he might have had a slight Chinese accent, and sometimes he pronounced words wrong, but he was able to speak incredibly fluidly and effortlessly, had many Japanese friends and lived his life almost exclusively in Japanese, and above all, he was a good conversationalist. He has attained a level that can only be dreamed of by most of the pitch pursuers. In Tokyo at least, I've noticed that there are more foreigners with very natural, nearly perfect accents in Japanese than you would expect, and most natives aren't really impressed by that. For many people it won't even register. One thing people are vastly more impressed by is an ability to read, because there are many foreigners who are extremely fluent but still struggle with kanji. It's so easy to get swept up in all the pitch paranoia. It's worrying to think that there's some defect in your accent that you're not aware of but is plain and obvious to those around you. That there's some disease in your speech that you're not even aware of, and everyone you talk to is secretly judging you because of it. Just know, they really don't give a fuck. But let's say for some reason or other you really want to sound native and attain the most natural sounding accent. Will pitch accent really make you sound native? The majority of the most native sounding second language Japanese speakers didn't even worry about pitch accent. So on YouTube there's a Japanese woman learning English through Immersion, and she has a playlist released about 2 years ago in which she and her husband go through and nitpick advanced learners Japanese as requested by viewers. This might seem petty, but it was intended for advanced learners who aspire to attain perfect Japanese, as well as to answer the question of whether a second language learner can sound 100% native. There were a few Japanese learners who, according to these videos, sounded completely native. Many of them either had little experience studying it, or had never studied pitch accent at all, and would even frequently make so-called pitch accent mistakes. On the other hand, there were some who had more accurate pitch by Tokyo standards and yet sounded less native. Their conclusion was that pitch accent really isn't a big deal, and that even if your goal is to sound native, there are other factors that are much more important for sounding native. Things like your actual pronunciation and the flow of your speech, which are things which I personally believed can be harmed by pitch accent obsession. Just take a look at this clip in which they conclude that a Czech man fluent in Japanese sounds completely native despite constantly making what would be considered mistakes if you were to judge by the standards of the Japanese spoken in Tokyo.
標準語に限定するなら、
標準語ではないんだけど、でもネイティブに聞こえるから。
そうだね。
ピッチなんてそんなね、気にしないんだよ。発音が良ければ。
そうだね。
If you speak naturally with a native-like pronunciation, even if you mess up the pitch accent, it'll often just sound like a native with a bit of a regional accent. There's even a video where they find a video of someone who's from Okinawa speaking standard Japanese and nitpicking her Japanese to prove that even many Japanese natives make what the pitch purists would call mistakes. It's easy for pitch peddlers to point out all the mistakes that advanced learners make, but it's just as easy to forget that you could do the same with many natives. There's also one important distinction to consider that's often overlooked: the technical difference between intonation and pitch. In conversation, these two terms are usually used interchangeably, and I don't believe there's any practical reason for learners to distinguish between them. But to put it simply, pitch accent is when you go up and down, and intonation is how far you go up and down. For example, on a piano, I might go up one note or two notes. In both cases, its pitch is rising, but how far it rises makes it sound completely different. That's intonation. I would argue that intonation is far more important for sounding native than pitch accent, and I'm convinced that a major reason why many of those who make pitch mistakes and yet still sound native is because of natural intonation, as all natives are invariably going to have native-like intonation even if the pitch accent varies by region, and intonation is something that can only be acquired naturally and subconsciously through lots of input. Most pro-pitch arguments are based on obsessive perfectionism. This is probably the main reason for the pitch paranoia over the last few years: obsessive perfectionism. Just look at one of the most prominent pitch professionals on the internet, Matt vs Japan. Stalking his Twitter page in preparation for this video, it's pretty clear that he has an intense intellectual fascination with pitch accent as a system of analytical study. In other words, he's a pitch nerd. There's nothing wrong with this, and I would never dream of discouraging anyone interested in something to avoid studying and learn about it if they derive pleasure from doing so. But the problem arises when you conflate your interest in something with necessity. It's one thing to study and dissect the intricacies of a language in your pastime for fun, and another to argue that without it, you ruin your ability and annoy people with how awful you sound. This is often reflected in many of the pro-pitch propositions, which drastically overestimate the importance of pitch accent and the negative consequences of having so-called poor pitch. Just look at this comment. Anyone watching this video will probably recognize how incredibly ridiculous it is to equate the occasional intonation mistake of a word with having a thick Chinese accent, and yet this is the type of rhetoric that can often be seen by pitch propagandists. Going through the most prominent pro-pitch points, it becomes clear that another significant part of the emphasis on pitch accent seems to arise from a desire to make oneself look good and impress natives, even to avoid being judged negatively by Japanese speakers who are prejudiced towards non-standard Japanese accents. But to me, worrying about this seems to suggest a sort of insecurity that will take a lot more than a bit of pitch accent study to fix. Why go into so much effort just to impress a small minority of people who would judge you for making subtle mistakes that most people probably wouldn't even notice? If you love pitch accent and enjoy studying it, or for some reason have an intense desire to sound like a perfect Tokyo native, then by all means go ahead. But the majority of immersion learners have absolutely no need, and probably won't see much, if any, merit in studying it. And as I mentioned earlier, studying it may even hinder your speaking ability. Language learning is simple and doesn't need to be complicated. The great thing about immersion learning is how simple it is. Theoretically, all you need to learn a language to fluency is to just sit down and consume a lot of comprehensible input. Originally, immersion learning was about culling the fat, getting rid of all the unnecessary complications like grammar and memorization, and stripping language learning to its essential core, throwing away all the bits that don't matter and only keeping the bits that do. And yet people keep seeming to find ways to overthink and needlessly complicate such a simple and elegant process. There are many potential causes for this. Marketing is a big one. There are people who financially benefit from the pitch mania, and people tend to get easily swept up in it simply because they can't trust the process. It's hard to believe something so complicated as a language can be learnt so easily and effortlessly. Perhaps the vacuum left by removing traditional study makes people uneasy, and they feel they need to fill it with some secret formula, some panacea to fix everything and make everything perfect. But trust me, just keep listening and reading and you'll get there. That's it. It's so simple. There's no need to overcomplicate it. Just sit back, relax, and keep getting input. It's that simple. Thanks for watching.